Hello and welcome to another episode of Ask the History Buff. I am Lynette, your curious Canadian history buff. I am not a degreed historian with letters behind my name, but I have researched more of Canadian history than most people have. I'm always discovering new, interesting information which excites me. And that's why I call myself the curious Canadian history buff. When I read something about Canadian history that I do not understand, I Google people's names and events surrounding them to understand their impact on society. I follow rabbit trails to see if I could understand what made the influencer tick, what influenced his or her life, and why he or she did what they did, and what events allowed them to leave an impact. Hopefully, you will be inspired to research something you hear on Ask the History Buff. In fact, Christian listeners are encouraged to become Bereans by researching the information themselves. And if you find any information that will inform, educate, and inspire other listeners, then send your nuggets in to info@christianrootscanada.org. And if you have any questions about any aspect of our history, or questions based on what you heard on Ask the History Buff, then send in your questions to info@christianrootscanada.org. If we don't know the answer, we will either send you a link to a trusted source of information or research it ourselves and let you know. And just remember, we will be looking at the influencers, their influence, and the lasting effect of their influence on Canada. For example, we are looking at June 24th, the St. Jean-Baptiste Day. I think that day should be a day of national celebration. And here's why. Saint Jean Baptiste Day is called Fête Nationale in Quebec. And my premise is that since June 24th, Saint Jean Baptiste Day, should be a day of Canadian celebration, a national day of celebration. And why is that? Because on that day in 1604, the nucleus of the foundations of Canada was laid. Who were the influencers, you may ask? King Henry IV of France, Pierre de Guademont, and Samuel de Champlain. In episode 1, we traced the beginning of the Saint Jean Baptiste Day celebrations from 1634 until the British Conquest in 1759. Now, between 1759 and 1834, we do not have any record of the celebration of Saint Jean Baptiste Day. And that's based on my initial research. It is not certain that Saint Jean Baptiste Day was celebrated after the British conquest on the Plains of Abraham in 1759, and it was not celebrated until 1834 because of a series of events. The celebration got a boost in the early 1800s. During that time, it took on a political tone as the new colony adjusted to a system of administration which was the British parliamentary system. And that was not practiced in the colonies the way that it should have been. Some of the events which took place during that time in the early 1800s was the beginning of political disagreements between the group called the Chateau Clique and the Legislative Assembly. Another event was an attempt at political change, and that created political dissidence. And those two things, political disagreements and an attempt to change, brought about the Lower Canada Rebellion. Rumblings of discontent were already heard in the spring of 1834. Britain's attempt at implementing that parliamentary system of government to a colony oceans away bred corruption in the Executive Council and the King's Council. Apparently, the appointed positions of Executive Council members and members of the King's Council were held by British loyalists, wealthy businessmen, and British professionals, and they influenced the Governor General's decisions for the colony. And those decisions were made on behalf of the Crown. It is claimed that members of both the Executive Council and the King's Council undermined the decisions and will of the elected body, which was the Legislative Assembly. And the Legislative Assembly was made up largely of Francophone descendants. So this bred animosity between French Canadians and English speaking Canadians. Maybe, just maybe, at that time, for French Canada, June 24th represented what made them French. Remember, the Legislative Assembly was largely French speakers. And they thought what made them French would be Catholicism and its feast days. Therefore, in 1829 already, there was an attempt to write an anthem to celebrate that Frenchness and to celebrate St. Jean-Baptiste Day. This anthem experienced a very short-lived success. The lyrics, which began "So Canadian Terre Chérie," Canadian soil, cherished land, were written by Isidore Bédard with music by Theodore Mote. But unresolved social and political issues eventually boiled over into the Lower Canada Rebellion. And that happened in Quebec. And just so you know, a similar situation, political situation, existed in Ontario, which was Upper Canada. Even though the influences involved were of British and loyalist extraction. And that resulted, those disagreements between the elected and unelected officials, that disagreement boiled over into the Upper Canada Rebellion in what is now Ontario. In both Upper and Lower Canada, the issue seemed to be the same, that the brand of British parliamentary system was not being practiced the way that it should have been. In Quebec, the Legislative Assembly, like we said, mostly French Canadians, they felt that they were stripped of their power and authority, and that initiated the development of the Parti Patriots. And that the Parti Patriots, you would see the changes that they've gone through from 1834. So from 1834 the celebration of June 24th as Saint Jean-Baptiste Day took on political overtones, which began the unraveling of the original meaning and intent of June 24th, a religious feast day to celebrate the birth of John the Baptist. That became a lightning rod for identity politics and the sovereigntist movement in Quebec. Louis-Joseph Papineau and his party patriots were agitating for parliamentary reform and even threatened to secede to America when their demands were not met. They had tried to initiate change, but some reports indicate that their efforts were sabotaged both at the appointed councils in Quebec and in the Parliament of England. So this bred anger and distrust between the French Quebecois and the British government and its representatives. Because in their minds, unelected officials who advised the Governor General, they were accused, rightfully so, of nepotism because certain families made up the core of the councils and they intermarried and passed the position on to the next of kin. So that's nepotism at its best. In French Canada, this group was called the Chateau Clique, while in English Canada, it was called the Family Compact, where the whole issue was unelected officials advised the Governor General, and because they belonged to certain families, they held on to their positions by marriage. So that created conflict both in Lower Canada, which was Quebec, and in Upper Canada. So in March 1834 now, the first St. Patrick's Day Society was formed by Irish Protestants as a reaction to the party patriots' 92 resolutions. The 92 resolutions was a long list of demands for political reform that they sent to England. It was drafted by Louis-Joseph Papineau and the members of the party patriots. The Irish Protestants interpreted this document as an act of disloyalty to the British Crown. So in March 1834, instead of just having a Saint Jean-Baptiste Day, a Saint Jean-Baptiste Society was formed. And that became the central organizing principle for a movement which became the Us Against Them movement. So instead of just celebrating Saint Jean-Baptiste Day, now instead of celebrating just a day, there was now the Saint Jean-Baptiste Society, which had other political aims. Other party patriots attended the St. Patrick's Day celebrations, which they had, the first St. Patrick's Day celebrations. The St. Jean-Baptiste Society seemed to be inextricably integrated with the party patriots. The society was distinctly pro-French and anti-English, and that gave rise to the birth of patriotism in Quebec and purportedly sought to promote and protect Quebec Francophone interests. So you see, it was not just celebrating a day of feasting or nativity of John the Baptist. It was now protecting and promoting Quebec Francophone interests. It became the vehicle which promoted the Quebec sovereigntist movement and gave the Legislative Assembly something uniquely French to celebrate. On June 24, 1834, Sir Georges Etienne Cartier, and some of you would know that name, he composed the lyrics for one version of O Canada with music composed by J.B. LaBelle. Sir Georges Etienne Cartier was a statesman, a lawyer, one of the fathers of Confederation, and one of the leaders of the Lower Canada Rebellion in the party Patriots. When both Upper and Lower Canada were reunited by Britain, he served alongside Sir John A. Macdonald as co-premier of the United Canada from 1857 to 1862. And the anthem that he wrote began, O Canada, mon pays, mes amours. O Canada, my country, my loves. And was reportedly sang during a patriotic banquet in Montreal, attended by a crowd of about 60 people, both English and French. It has been suggested that at that time, the song referred to just Lower Canada. At that banquet, attendees lustily toasted the party patriot, of course, the French sovereignty, the United States because they were enamored with republicanism, and they toasted Ireland, the British Catholic conflict probably. Just like in 1829, the success and popularity of this version of an anthem was short-lived. By June 24, 1834, there was a guy by the name of Ludger Duvernay who played a very, very important part in the Lower Canada Rebellion. He was a newspaper publisher, and he announced that the Saint Jean-Baptiste Day was a day to celebrate Canadian history with history and culture. This should have pointed right back to the settlement on St. Croix Island, but there was no mention about the settlement on St. Croix Island. The Lower Canada rebellions happened in 1837, that's 3 years later, and in 1837 and 1838. And during that time, Duvernay and other patriots were exiled in the US. Of course, they loved republicanism. They wanted to secede to America, and they were exiled in the US for 4 years until 1842. And as soon as he returned, Ludger Duvernay returned, he revived the Saint Jean-Baptiste celebrations as a call for unity among French Canadians. As a result, Duvernay began the Association Saint Jean-Baptiste of Montreal on June 9, 1843, the next year after he came back, initiating the first Saint Jean-Baptiste parade in Montreal on that day. Initially, the celebration was very Catholic because they celebrated with a banquet, then a mass, and then mass distribution of consecrated bread and a parade. As time went along, in 1908, the Saint Jean-Baptiste celebration, take 5. In 1908, Saint John the Baptist became the patron saint. He was adopted as the patron saint of French Canadians. And the day did not become a public holiday until 1925. During the 1960s and 70s, the years of the Quiet Revolution, Saint Jean-Baptiste Day became more political in focus and less religious. Eventually, all semblance of its religious beginnings was expunged by the government of René Lévesque when he renamed the celebrations Fête Nationale du Québec. So, what's the point? St. Jean-Baptiste Day was hijacked from a religious celebration to a political celebration. Past influences of that day have shaped our current Canadian society, and they include the Lower Canada Rebellion and the birth of the Quebec sovereignty movement. The influencers were Lodja Duvernay and Louis-Joseph Papineau, and eventually René Lévesque when he renamed the celebrations Fête Nationale du Québec. And that is what is still celebrated today. The action they took was the following. It was the politicizing of the celebration as French identity, even though they have expunged the original religious aspect of the celebration of Saint Jean-Baptiste Day. We can see from its history that the day of the first settlement in Canada was never the purpose of the celebration. Instead, the religious holiday from France was the focus of all celebrations. In 2024, that day no longer has religious significance. Therefore, celebrating its historical significance, I think, is more important. And that's because all of Canada started with that settlement on St. Croix Island because of Pierre de Guademont and Samuel Champlain. The settlement began on June 24, 1604, on the celebration of the Feast of St. John the Baptist, the birth of Canada in Acadia. St. Croix Island is now in Maine because of the way that the British and Americans decided the line for the US-Canada border. But you can visit St. Croix Island in Maine and see all of the foundations that were laid by Dubois and Champlain. And it is a huge tourist attraction in Maine. So you can visit Maine and verify that that's where the very first settlement for Canada began. Because St. Croix Island was not suitable for a settlement at that time, the settlers moved across the Bay of Fundy to Port Royal, which is now called Annapolis Royal. And all of that is our history too. And that's why I think that day, June 24th, should be a national Canadian celebration, the nucleus of the beginning of Canada. Let us know what you think in a comment below.